maternal milk softened by fraternal tears. We had to have a fine flow of blood. After all, we are too numerous, and war takes away a quantity of men who were living because they were born. Among the thousands and thousands of carcasses interlaced in death, all alike in their shrouds, how many are there who would merit, I don't say a tear, but a memory? Giovanni Papini in La Avanti, April 6, 1916. Quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Thomas Jefferson. When outside observers deplore the violence associated with fascism, they often mention its incivility, its shocking brutality, and its needlessness. One could gain the impression that they would be heartily in support of a clean, bloodless fascism, so long as its violent acts were rationally demonstrated as necessary. In point of fact, for early fascist movements, violence was not simply a messy means to an end, but an end unto itself. This could not be the case for establishment fascism, which eventually needs to normalize society, which cannot exist in a state of emergency forever without fraying. Violence has to be left safely in the past or put out of sight in the camps. But before the rupture can be healed, it has to first occur, and occur on all levels, the social, emotional, and physical. The Italian futurists were perhaps most responsible for the aestheticization of violence, if not for its physical enactment. Voyeurs of war, they applauded most acts that broke the social peace. Quote, "Futurism disregarded the theories of left and right and created the criteria of authenticity and decadence, future and past, speed and slowness. Warfare was held to be beautiful, authentic, fast, and present. In warfare, genuine camaraderie could be generated," their leader Marinetti held, in fighting against, quote, "the sluggish and overbearing hegemony of mediocrity towards the paradise of the impossible." The futurists rejoiced in the outbreak of World War I. Quote, "The grandiose metaphors of war as a mystical, orgiastic experience of the Darwinian/Nietzschean principle of life as struggle, of war as a cleansing process beneficial and vital for a healthy organism, finally appeared to have become reality." Not only did they think the actual death of millions would be beneficial to the world, the hygiene of social Darwinism in action, they thought the violence itself would be redemptively meaningless. Quote, "Although the futurists and the vorticists did not view war and violence as constituting modernity in themselves, they approved of modern war as it was liable to be nihilistic. The redemptive power of destruction and the living force of conflict knew no limits for the futurists. In this, the myth of modern war and heroic technology provided fuel for the nihilistic temperament of futurism. This line of thought was theoretically derived from the writings of Georges Sorel, though he himself found futurism foolish. Sorel was a French revolutionary syndicalist, heavily influenced by the writing of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, an early anarchist. Sorel believed that the general strike, a projected time in which all workers would refuse work on capitalist terms, seize the means of production, and enact an anarchist society, was the vital and redemptive myth of his time. He saw violence as a necessary element of the general strike, and so theorized how a bloodbath might be avoided via the ethics developed between workers. Nevertheless, he saw violence not only as a regrettable means to an end, but as a means of attaining transcendent and revolutionary emotion. Quote, "Sorel's violence was not an appeal to terrorist bloodshed. It was rather a metaphysical principle which found expression in any form of struggle or action. He saw it as a creative force that could be active in artists, inventors, and warriors imbued with individuality and originality, and, therefore, a revolutionary mentality." This formulation made his writing ideal for adoption by those influenced by Nietzschean depictions of the Superman, that is, most futurist and pre-fascist thinkers. Quote, "By depicting the economic myth of the general strike in terms of the emotions which accompany adventures in battle, Sorel can maintain that the four attributes of creativity, mystery, struggle, and direct experience impart to the souls of the workers a sense of the sublime, analogous to the poetic spirit of those periods in history which have experienced a return to barbarism. This feeling of the sublime cannot be analyzed or broken down. Separating it into its component parts denatures it. That is why the quality of mystery constitutes perhaps the most important aspect of the general strike. Unfortunately for all of us, this mysterious and mystical formulation meant that Sorel's ideas on violence were easily lifted free of their containing idea of the general strike and transported into fascist realms. Mussolini said that everything he was he owed to Sorel. He is an accomplished master who, with his sharp theories on revolutionary formations, contributed to the molding of the discipline, the collective energy, the massed power of the fascist cohorts. Marinetti adored him. Sorel's ideas are the source for futurism's ecstatic glorification of violence as an end in itself. While Sorel wavered between returning this appreciation and expressing uncertainty towards the fascist project, perhaps the best evaluation of the compatibility of his ideas with fascism is made within his own theoretical framework. Sorel counterposed the idea of revolutionary violence to the brutality of the state it resisted. Quote, "Working-class violence must be relatively free from vengeance, jealousy, hatred, and tyrannical bloodletting." Stanley observes that Camus, who was also influenced by Sorel, expressed this necessity in The Rebel by forming a distinction between, quote, "rebellion, an act of refusal of existing repression, from revolution, which attacks the existing order with both a plan for the future organization and a worked-out theory of historical destiny, usually rooted in the ideology of progress." Fascism fails these tests. It was both brutal, Sorel's test, and revolutionary by Camus' standard. The state it enacted in Italy was one based in a sense of both historical destiny and progress, while explaining itself as profoundly anti-progressive. However sublime the sensation of violence might have felt to its enactors, its outcomes were not noticeably less banal and ugly. Moreover, Sorel and Mussolini shared, along with many other revolutionists on both the left and the right, the conviction that a revolutionary few had the destiny, indeed the ethical imperative, of shaping the future of the world by manipulating or educating the masses. Sorel places the revolutionary subject/actor in the role of master in Nietzsche's master-slave dichotomy. He saw consumers as slaves with weak morality, producer revolutionaries as masters with heroic qualities, in an exact demonstration of the sort of valorization of the poor that Nietzsche intended to attack. As I will discuss in a later section, any take on the master-slave formulation is unlikely to be compatible with anti-authoritarian perspectives, and lends itself better to fascism or statist communism than to freedom. While any are free to act on their own, or as a small group, by the lights of autonomy, autonomy itself is destroyed once such elites begin to see their mission as one of control over the revolutionary subject. 2. The revolutionary subject often disappoints. People are not their predicates, and often these predicates overlap or contradict. What producer is not also a consumer? The situation is more complicated than that of the parasitic bourgeoisie clinging to the back of the proletariat, or the Third World in virtuous revolt against the American Empire. Importantly, the Volkish conception of the peasant also had to do with an essentialist assertion that the peasant was at home within violence, a ready participant, not a passive observer nor a victim. Volkish authors dwelled upon the peasants who defended themselves during the 30 Years' War. Quote, "The peasants had discovered their aggressive, warlike instincts and broke through the superimposed layer of civilization." Later National Socialists, wishing to bring forth the Nietzschean Superman, saw in this perceived rupture hope for the German people through the enactment of violence. Violence as an internal means, as well as an external means, to accomplishing the purification of the German land and heightening of the German soul. Arendt also points to the idealization of the violence of the mob and the ideology of anti-Semitic French intellectuals who participated in the Dreyfus Affair. They, quote, "saw in the mob a living expression of virile and primitive strength." The futurists, as well, admired the, quote, "noble savage, contemptuous of history," in a fetishization of the primitive other. While I find the common assertion that violence is inherently misogynist to be a repulsively sexist reduction itself, I do think the exaltation of virility, particularly when represented in unison with violence, is misogynist. It is no accident that D'Annunzio, the Italian proto-fascist Superman, praised his imagined ancestors for the beautiful women they raped, as well as for the glorious battles they fought. Futurism gained its edginess by advocating not only the burning of libraries and art museums, but also scorn for women. It is always so among white men who feel disenfranchised. When striking out in frustration at some handy scapegoat, white femmes and people of color are their nearest targets. We can see it now in the United States, in the men's rights activist scene, in the various online explosions of misogynist hatred, in the murder of women by angry male virgins, and the rhetoric of the alt-right. This attitude is the result of a willful misidentification of enemy combined with a sense of betrayed entitlement. It is a hallmark of the abuser as well as of the fascist. Furthermore, the assertion that violence without context purifies the soul and uplifts its enactor is based in a rejection of the less violent aspects of life, and an assertion that there are such nonviolent enterprises. In reacting against the home, against femininity, against the decadence, a term that cannot but evoke homosexuality, given the popular view of the fall of Rome, that afflicts modern civilization, and assigning blame for alienation and atomization to a vague culture rather than to the workings of capitalist, state, and colonial power, this analysis makes invisible the violent exercises of power in all of those realms. It is a case of mistaking a sense of empowerment for real power, and it ignores the often ugly consequences for both the enactors of violence and their victims. For Sorel, the virtue of conflict lay in the conflict itself. Conflict was utopia. Quote, history, according to Sorel, was a history of violence. It is impossible, he believed, to understand history without understanding the role of violence. The positive value of violence, which was characterized by such terms as pure, idealistic, just, and purified. It may be valid to view history as a history of violence, but morally elevating it in this way ignores and obscures how violence is practically administered. While many in struggle of all kinds have found violence inherent to their project, the Sorelian mentality mistakes an awful reality for an end goal. In doing so, it turns its utopia into something uglier than what it was meant to oppose. Two, religion, myth, and intellectual opportunism. The most important aspect of Sorel's valorization of the general strike is its mythic nature, not its desirability as a tactic. As Ohana puts it, Sorel's general strike, quote, has no achievable purposes, it has no concrete plan of action, and it is not formulated in terms of political action. The general strike is a myth, a series of ideas. It is of little importance if the general strike is partly successful or only a product of the popular fantasy. The importance lies in the infusion of fighting spirit into the proletarian masses and the capitalist owners. Quote, I understand that the myth of the general strike astounds many cautious people because of its interminable nature. Actually, this feature of the general strike underlies its mythical, not its practical nature. Myth drives people to do what they would otherwise never do, and as the Volkish movement slowly transitioned away from Christianity, it needed replacement myths in order to avoid becoming simply an alternative lifestyle choice. In the meantime, the movement readily capitalized on Christian anti-Semitism and new chosen people mentality. Moss says that there is a tendency to substitute the image of the Volk for the person and function of Christ. Volks revived the Wotan cult, the sun cult, and had a general adoration of primitivism. Later, of course, Nazi Germany became obsessed with crypto-Hindu mysticism as a way of affirming their Aryan roots. Novels were used to resurrect and reinvent the glorious past of the German people. Its modern degeneracy symbolized the death of the Christian God. Some writers extrapolated Germans' ancient destiny to rule from Tacitus's description of the Goth invasion of Rome, amazing, as Mussolini later justified the Italian destiny to rule on the basis of the Roman Empire. An influential writer proclaimed that a revolution and defeat of the racial enemy would be a cosmically inspired breakthrough by Aryans. Moss describes this particularly vivid image. Many Germans came to see themselves as knights riding bravely between death and the devil. In short, God was in the Germans, the devil in the Jews. The conflict took on the tone of an epic moral battle between good and evil. For those inclined neither towards leftist labor myth nor Christianity, several philosophers were available to justify their political drift. Heidegger. Martin Heidegger may not have been an anti-Semite as a matter of personal belief, but he was certainly a Nazi, at least for the year of 1933. In that time, he glorified the Nazi Party and Hitler as Nietzschean supermen, schemed with the party to become rector of a university where he promoted party interests. He dismissed all Jewish faculty from the university, reorganized the university governance according to the Führer principle, and, variously, hurt or helped exceptional Jews who still remained in academia. His wife was a Nazi long before he was, and was an open anti-Semite. During this year of his strongest collaboration, Hannah Arendt, his former lover, asked Heidegger about the rumors that he was a vicious Nazi, and he denied everything. As a prominent intellectual, his support of the party was certainly influential to German opinion, as would have been his denunciation, had he made one. Heidegger saw the Nazi Revolution as a collective breakout from Plato's cave, an end to the distractions of the modern world and a return to the ecstatic practice of being that had been lost since the high days of Greece. He rhapsodized over the spirit and power of the Volk, rooted in soil and blood, their granite will like the mountains of the German countryside, their hearts nourished like German sunshine. He declared that in the new Reich, the university would take on the task of bringing into reality a new, selfless, hard race of young men and women reflecting the strengths and the will of the new Reich and its chancellor, Hitler, who alone, he said, is the present and future German reality and its law. Heidegger aspired to the role of chief philosopher of the National Socialist Revolution. His retreat to his home, which took place only once it was clear that he had fallen into disfavor, and eventual renunciation of the party were entirely opportunistic. He covered his initial retreat by saying he needed to be among the Volk rather than living the rarefied intellectual life of Berlin, but later claimed he had in fact seen the horrors of Nazism completely and wanted to turn away from the party. It is less necessary to identify Heidegger's crimes and his ethical failings, however. Why did he not acknowledge and denounce the events unfolding around him? Why did he not, at the very least, show solidarity to the particular Jews he had known and cared for, such as Arendt? Heidegger is an excellent example of how one can be fascist without being particularly racist. Arendt famously described the banality of evil Eichmann embodied. Perhaps even more banal than a functionary like Eichmann is a conceited academic taking up a cause for personal gain with great excitement while choosing to ignore its implications. For him, to love the Volk was to kill the Jew, even if he refused to acknowledge it. Arendt avoided this sort of trap by refusing to love any people, instead loving particular people, and was roundly denounced by Zionists for it later. Nor did she ever trust other intellectuals after the Shoah, and perhaps in particular after Heidegger's betrayal, though she did much to rehabilitate his reputation. Quote, in an interview on German television in the 1960s, Arendt recalled that, while she lived in an intellectual milieu, she also knew ordinary working people, and that it was intellectuals who were most enthusiastic about cooperating with the regime. I'd never forget that, she said, and when I left Germany I was dominated by the idea, never again. I shall never again get involved in any kind of intellectual business. I want nothing to do with that lot. Nevertheless, she went on to continue to live and work in that milieu, however it disrespected her, out of her need to explore the truth. Heidegger stands as a contrast to her choices, choosing to trust intellectualism over taking an ethical stand. However he valued the Volk, he seems to have primarily loved himself. Junger. If Heidegger represents the urge to return to the authentic past within semi-Nazi intellectuals of the time, Ernst Junger served as the mythic bridge that allowed the Nazis to ideologically journey towards techno-dystopian efficiency and modernity. Junger, who served in World War I, wrote a best-selling book in Germany between the wars. Through this book he, quote, became the spokesman of the generation of the trenches that had sacrificed all and felt that they had received nothing in return. This disenfranchised veteran class is always a strong constituency of reactionary movements. Junger wanted a male community based on warfare experiences. Quote, the war, which produced the new communal masculine relationship, was not seen by Junger as an experience of the past, a trauma or something unrepeatable, but as an ever-valid model and a creative phenomenon. Quote, battle is not only destruction, but also the masculine form of creation. This is a clear example of the ways in which essentialism is bad for everyone, including men, as women can participate in all acts of destruction, and do so when sexism does not prevent them from such participation, so men can take part in actual acts of creation, rather than sublimating them into warfare. But for Junger, war experience became central to everything. Quote, from Junger's point of view, to write articles, poems, or stories as if the language itself had not inhaled poisoned air or been pierced by barbed wire was romantic evasion or bourgeois illusion at a time when the very foundations of bourgeois culture had been undermined. Language had become a part of the violent structure of the world. One is reminded of Adorno, who said, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. Junger, an unrepentant elitist, did not care much for the Nazis because they were populists, used the populist tool of race, and were, by his lights, too liberal. However, he allowed himself to be used by them. Junger's focus on authenticity allowed for a separation of technology from civilization in proto-Nazi rhetoric, which led to the eventual elevation of technology, mysterious otherwise if one considers the, at least cosmetically, agrarian roots of Volkisch ideology. Quote, according to Adorno, the jargon of authenticity associated technology with spontaneity, experimentation, feelings, blood, will, and instinct, while civilization was associated with abstraction, intellect, reason, and conceptualization. Hitler himself never agreed with the Volkisch hostility to technology. Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, said in a 1939 speech at a motor show in Berlin, quote, while bourgeois reaction was alien to and filled with incomprehension, if not hostility to technology, and while modern skeptics believe the deepest roots of the collapse of European culture lay in it, National Socialism understood how to take the soulless framework of technology and fill it with the rhythm and hot impulses of our time. Nietzsche's work was also useful in the separation of technology from the hated modernity. From Sorel to Mussolini and the German conservative revolutionaries, the technological vision was linked to the will to power. A 1930 essay, National Socialism and Technology, the Spirituality of the National Socialist Movement, argued that racism itself was a necessary element in separating technology from the enemy and making it a part of the Nazi project. Quote, the aim of Nazism was declared to be the liberation of technology from the rule of money and Jewish materialism. Technology was thus not the material foundation of Nazism, but an independent factor in a new post-materialist culture. Henry Ford's factory model was praised as productive capital and contrasted with Jewish capital. Later, the Nazi Bureau for Work Aesthetics transformed blue-collar technological workers into a means of suppressing class warfare. Junger and Heidegger shared a conception of modern freedom as freedom to work. The Nazis claimed that there is a direct connection between the metaphysical significance given to work by thinkers such as Junger and Heidegger and the performance of work on behalf of Germany. Here one must ask the question, was the inscription on the gates of Auschwitz, "Work liberates," a cynical exploitation of Junger's thought, or its logical conclusion? Hitler, Eichmann, and Nazi workplace culture. Quote, the revolt against the Jews rather than against social injustices or economic and political forces was an element in the Volkisch thinking which Adolf Hitler was to exploit to the fullest. As a sham revolution, it promised much. Above all, it precluded a genuine social upheaval. Thus, the Jews were crucial foils. In this context, the Volkisch movement was bound to become popular. Smash the Jewish conspiracy, and the Volk will bloom forth unhindered. In fact, the elimination of all Jews would be accepted as a deed of liberation. Hitler plumbed all possibilities, and with devoted, pliable, and acquiescent accomplices, even carried out the anti-Jewish revolution, beyond the belief of those who accepted his promises in Mein Kampf at face value. George Moss. The National Socialist Party was a product of that idealism of deeds, which Volkisch thought had always advocated. Later Volkisch philosophy had become one of inner revolution and outer expansion, and Hitler seized the moment to urge such expansion. The anti-Semitism that had become integral to the Volkisch project was also integral to Hitler's psychological makeup. His anti-Semitism was based on his personal fears, his opposition to the urban life with which Volkism had identified Jews, and his hatred of the, quote, debased elite. But Hitler quite deliberately deployed anti-Semitism as a tactical point of unity, transforming the Volkisch tendency, with its Bund and youth groups and land projects, into a politicized fighting force. Quote, above all, the Bund failed to unite. As we know, Hitler did not make the same mistake. By instituting a social program, making skillful use of propaganda, and training a dynamic leadership, Hitler solved the problem for the Nazis. It took the genius of Adolf Hitler to wed the Volkisch flight from reality to political discipline and efficient political organization. This moment of political transformation illustrates a typical makeup of fascist social structure. There is a mass of sympathizers around a core of fanatics, which makes the fanatics feel that they are not fringe radicals, but a brave vanguard backed by an immense force. The sympathizers, meanwhile, translate the fanatic ideas to the mainstream and appear fairly reasonable, thus acclimating the outside world of fascism such that the interior subculture gradually becomes the exterior world. There is, then, a double enforcement of membership, a sense of normalcy imposed from without so that one's crimes seem valid, and of complicity and violence within, making it feel impossible to leave without becoming a betrayer, or possibly a victim yourself. Meanwhile, the cynicism of elite fanatics towards reality as it currently exists moves the whole world towards realizing the elite's preferred fiction. The National Socialist Party was originally quite anti-bourgeois, but as it became clear that most proletarians were going to stay leftist, Hitler consciously, quote, opted for legitimacy for the bourgeoisie and against the pernicious forces of the Jewish Hydra. On a practical level, building affinity with the powerful gave him funding sources. A racially divided dual platform was developed as a solution for Nazis, the bourgeois, and the majority Gentile Germans. The elimination of the bourgeois class, of Jews, the importance of family values, for Aryans, and so on. Many Germans desired a revolution, but not a corresponding shift in social and economic relationships. By stressing the spiritual transformation of the Volk and making the only victims of the revolution Jews and other undesirables, Hitler strategically utilized the revolutionary longings and grievances of Germans to gain power without destroying capitalism. Hitler's charisma is frequently blamed for his success, but it was far more tactical than magical. Quote, society is always prone to accept a person offhand for what he pretends to be, so that a crackpot posing as a genius always has a certain chance to be believed. The hair-raising arbitrariness of such fanaticism holds great fascination for society because for the duration of the social gathering, it is freed from the chaos of opinions that it constantly generates, Arendt tells us. While Hitler held his anti-Semitism close, Eichmann, one of the less important of his underlings, did not particularly hate Jews. In fact, Eichmann was converted to Zionism by reading Theodor Herzl's Der Judenstaat. After that, he, quote, thought of hardly anything but a political solution and how to get some firm ground under the feet of the Jews. To facilitate this immigration, he instituted a process that has since become familiar. Quote, at one end, you put in a Jew who still has some property, and he goes through the building from counter to counter, from office to office, and comes out the other end without any money, without any rights, with only a passport on which it says, You must leave the country within a fortnight, otherwise you will go to a concentration camp. This is Arendt's representation of the views of Jewish community leaders whom Eichmann invited to see this process, of which he was proud. In Eichmann, the slow bureaucratic horror of biopolitical management matured. He was not opposed to doing things in the interests of a few Jews. For example, Jews from Palestine treated with Nazi Germany to pick young Jewish pioneers from among the Jews in the concentration camps. They then illegally brought them to British-governed Palestine. Eichmann enthusiastically and politely worked with them towards this common goal. For neither party, it seems, was this project incompatible with the existence of the concentration camps. As Arendt famously pointed out, Eichmann was normal. It is normal to be evil, and in fact, understanding that proved destabilizing for those who examined him. It is this normalcy that is the true horror. Agamben makes a similar observation about the games of football that sometimes occurred between inmates and guards in the camps. Eichmann's only peculiarity, if you can call it that, is a belief that he was right to do only what he was told. Before his trial, Eichmann proposed to hang myself in public as a warning example for all anti-Semites on this earth. By this, he did not mean to say that he regretted anything. Repentance is for little children. Eichmann saw himself as a perfect idealist, a law-abiding citizen. He, like everybody else, had of course his personal feelings and emotions, but he would never permit them to interfere with his actions if they came into conflict with his idea. Eichmann was the perfect ideologue and the perfect functionary, Arendt says, because he lacked empathy. Quote, the longer one listened to him, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely, to think from the standpoint of somebody else. No communication was possible with him, not because he lied, but because he was safeguarded by the most reliable of all safeguards against the words and the presence of others, and hence against reality as such. While this may have been a function of his particular banality, it was facilitated and maintained by Nazi workplace ethics. Nazis had language rules for talking about their genocide, which served the double purpose of keeping the camps somewhat secret and the maintenance of order and sanity within their ranks. Quote, the net effect of this language system was not to keep these people ignorant of what they were doing, but to prevent them from equating it with their old, normal knowledge of murder and lies. Similarly, some Gentile Germans became, or claimed to have become, when guilt was being measured out after the end of the war, inner immigrants, those who secretly disbelieved in the Nazi program and lived as strangers among their own people, but only in terms of their private, inner lives. At most, they withdrew slightly from public life. Some took the opposite tack, pretending to be more Nazi than the Nazis, to preserve their own safety. This sort of doublethink goes along with the above double talk. At what point is pretense not simply reality? Quote, identification with the movement and total conformism seems to have destroyed the very capacity for experience, even if it be as extreme as torture or the fear of death. Until the spell was broken, at which point everyone knew that the Nazi project was insane and evil. Everyone knew and could not learn otherwise that it was the correct course of action. Hitler's fascism channeled bourgeois dissatisfaction. It was mystical, unrealistic, and positive. Quote, fascism was far from being purely nihilistic, meaning destructive. Indeed, the discovery of a positive ideology was what enabled some fascists to succeed, while their more negative confreres failed. Its mysticism was no barrier. Rather, it greased the wheels of material interest by creating a collaborative, homogenizing fiction. Quote, the success of totalitarian propaganda, however, does not rest so much on its demagoguery as on the knowledge that interest as a collective force can be felt only where stable social bodies provide the necessary transmission belts between the individual and the group. No effective propaganda based on mere interest can be carried on among masses whose chief characteristic is that they belong to no social or political body, and who therefore present a veritable chaos of individual interests. Arendt describes the line world of consistency established by Nazi ideology, something better, more comforting than reality itself, that both justified horrors and cushioned adherence from them. This fiction, this myth, generated a world of terror. For example, Hitler created a narrative of, quote, a class struggle caused by the Jewish businessman who exploits his workers, while at the same time his brother in the factory courtyard incites them to strike. This picture simultaneously defangs class struggle as a worthy enterprise and directs class resentment from the poor and fear from the bourgeoisie against the fictional machinations of the Jews. In this way, Arendt says, the assumption of a Jewish world conspiracy was transformed by totalitarian propaganda from an objective, arguable matter into the chief element of the Nazi reality. The point was that the Nazis acted as though the world was dominated by the Jews and needed a conspiracy to defend itself. Similarly, the entirely fictional Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which continue to inspire racist conspiracy theories today, at once generated and mirrored the real aims of the Nazis. Arendt observes that the Nazi slogan, "Right is what is good for the German people," is remarkably similar to the Protocols, "Everything that benefits the Jewish people is morally right and sacred." Fiction affects its author most of all. This is obvious in Eichmann's trial. Quote, Eichmann needed only to recall the past in order to feel assured that he was not lying and that he was not deceiving himself, for he and the world he lived in had once been in perfect harmony. The self-creating prophecy of the Nazis was incredibly material. Quote, the official SS newspaper, the Schwarzkopf, stated explicitly in 1938 that if the world was not yet convinced that the Jews were the scum of the earth, it soon would be when unidentifiable beggars, without nationality, without money, and without passports crossed their frontiers. And it is true that this kind of factual propaganda worked better than Goebbels' rhetoric, not only because it established the Jews as scum of the earth, but also because the incredible plight of an ever-growing group of innocent people was like a practical demonstration of the totalitarian movement's cynical claims that no such thing as inalienable human rights existed, and that the affirmations of the democracies to the contrary were mere prejudice, hypocrisy, and cowardice in the face of the cruel majesty of a new world. First, the stateless are deprived of home and of government protection. Then, once they are actually rendered superfluous, they can be killed with impunity. This was one of the points of concentration camps. Had Nazis simply rounded up all the Jews and shot them in the millions, civilized people might have protested. Quote, before they, the Nazis, set the gas chambers into motion, they had carefully tested the ground and found out to their satisfaction that no country would claim these people. The point is that a condition of complete rightlessness was created before the right to live was challenged. This process of dehumanization also took place in the ground level. The camps began as bullying fantasies brought to life, Arendt says, which at first simply employed pre-existing sadists. Then they were systematized and used to make humans into the SS. One guard reported, quote, usually I keep on hitting until I ejaculate. I have a wife and 3 children in Breslau. I used to be perfectly normal. That's what they made of me. Now when they give me a pass out of here, I don't go home. I don't dare look my wife in the face. In this way, differences are destroyed on both levels. Not to say that the damage done to the guards is at all comparable to the suffering of their victims, but to say that the Nazi goal was the systematic destruction of difference on all fronts, the conversion of people into mechanical sadists beating dehumanized flesh. This is not so different from Achille Mbembe's analysis of the libidinal nature of slavery in his theory of necropolitics, explored at length in a later section. Necropolitics was not invented in the Shoah, but certainly bloomed full and heavy in the camps. Arendt may not have realized its lack of originality, but her analysis otherwise stands. Quote, if we take totalitarian aspirations seriously and refuse to be misled by the common-sense assertion that they are utopian and unrealizable, it develops that the society of the dying established in the camps is the only form of society in which it is possible to dominate man entirely. Those who aspire to total domination must liquidate all spontaneity, such as the mere existence of individuality will always engender, and track it down in its most private forms, regardless of how unpolitical and harmless these may seem. The urge for consistency destroys difference and human dignity. This is an incredibly important aspect of fascism, which claims, after all, to realistically cope with difference. Jews are subhuman and must be exterminated. Mexicans are criminals and rapists and cannot be allowed across our borders. This aspect of fascism is memorably presented in Madeleine L'Engle's fictional work, A Wrinkle in Time. Quote, "But that's exactly what we have on Camazotz. Complete equality. Everybody exactly alike." For a moment her brain reeled with confusion. Then came a moment of blazing truth. "No," she cried triumphantly. "Like and equal are not the same thing at all." But Charles Wallace continued as though there had been no interruption. "In Camazotz all are equal. In Camazotz everybody is the same as everybody else." But he gave her no argument, provided no answer, and she held on to her moment of revelation. Like and equal are two entirely different things. If you are skeptical of the value of a young adult novel to the Anti-Fascist project, consider, when we are programmed as children to hate and fear the other, whatever form that other might take, it is sometimes only the critical tools provided by the liberatory mythologies of our youth that allow us to counter these arguments as adults. This is a very real challenge. Using a tone of prophetic science, Hitler got people to think of his project as one extending over millennia, which meant that the immediate atrocities were justified. Those who murdered Jews were made to believe that what they were doing was a grand, historic task. Himmler said, quote, "To have stuck it out and, apart from exceptions caused by the human condition, to have remained decent, that is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written." Their work was deliberately framed as unrelated to everyday cruelty, to which, of course, all civilized Germans were opposed. The gas chambers were glossed as mercy-killing. In fact, some Germans were angry that the gas was being wasted on the Jews when it ought to be preserved for Gentile Germans in case of Allied victory. To counter this ideology, a completely different worldview is necessary, something beyond pointing out the speciousness of its claims. And when the fascist project has gone beyond the theoretical phase and into its next murderous era, Arendt offers us a practical way to oppose such mystical doublethink. Quote, "Hitler spoke of dying classes that ought to be eliminated without much ado. The only valid argument under such conditions is promptly to rescue the person whose death is predicted." Failed explanations. Wilhelm Reich, in his popular early study, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, shows both an oppositional understanding of fascism and his own neuroses and unexamined tendencies towards essentialist ways of thinking. While few leftists would dispute that modern sexuality is malformed by patriarchy, and that this malformation contributes to many negative social forms and interactions in unspoken ways, it is a large stretch to argue, as Reich does, that it is the primary root of fascist tendencies. Moreover, Reich's essentialist understanding of gendered societies, and, in particular, his pathologizing of transgressive sexualities, irredeemably poisons his arguments from the start. His analysis seems to be more a diagnosis of his own sexual and mental difficulties than a realistic analysis of the motives behind fascism. He is not wrong that fascists were, and are, neurotics obsessed with curing the external factors they found responsible for the sorry state of the world. He just also shares this condition. His belief that sexual liberation will solve most of humanity's problems has not borne fruit and must be uprooted. Reich opposes the mysticism of racial purity. Quote, "Such views are unequivocally mystical. Nature wills and regulates. They are the logical continuation of biological metaphysics." This racism justifies imperialism. It was Hitler's view that humanity is divided into three kinds of races: those who establish culture, those who develop culture, and those who destroy culture. These mystical views do not stay strictly theoretical. Quote, by forming ideologies, people change themselves. The process of ideology formation has a material core. The fascists theorized a war of political, the Jewish materialism of Marx, and racial pollution versus mysticism and the purity of German blood and land. As Hitler put it, quote, race is the outer world of the soul. By Reich's analysis, such essentialist mysticism is necessary to the fascist drive and must be undone by humanistic science. Despite this basis of understanding, Reich falls into his own mysticism, that of the orgon, the orgasmic energy he believed is unconsciously transmitted between sexual participants, and sex economy, and, most relevantly, that of matriarchal nature. He sees matriarchy as the organization of the sex-economically natural society, and patriarchy as the authoritarian and catastrophically chaotic society built upon the perverted sex impulse. From a position that opposes all gendered power and does not take a conveniently reductionist view of history, this is not useful. Furthermore, he does not problematize pagan mysticism as he does Christian and crypto-mysticism. Quote, the mysticism of the sex-affirming matriarchal primitive is not due to sexual suppression as is the mysticism of the patriarchal individual. It is in part immediate orgiastic experience and in part animistic interpretation of natural processes. He observes, quote, fascist ideology, in contrast to Christian ideology, separates human orgiastic longing from the structure created by the authoritarian patriarchy and assigns it to various races. Nordic is equivalent to bright, heavenly, exalted, pure, asexual. Asiatic to instinctual, demonical, ecstatic, sexual, orgiastic. While we concur about the evolution of patriarchy and the governance of sexuality as an economic measure, and Reich correctly disassociates the construct of sexuality from racist imaginings, made one in many racist ideologies, he still gives credit to the mythology around natural forces in human society as a historical narrative of this shift, opposing patriarchal civilization to barbaric matriarchy's sensuality. To critique mysticism, he uncritically relies upon another mystical standpoint. He offers no explanation to back his claims that matriarchal societies are healthier, do not produce race or gendered violence, and are natural. He does not even cite evidence, though it exists, that they do or have existed. This tendency to uncritically exalt matriarchy as a natural form of organization continues within certain nature-reifying, essentialist efforts of today, examined in Section 4 of this text. Reich saw the formation of healthy sexuality as the most necessary development for the eradication of fascism. He opposes this healthy sexuality to that formed under Christianity, which is capitalized upon to reinforce fascist mysticism, honor, love of land and nation, sexual morality, duty. Reich believed that Christian sexual suppression in the adolescent makes them vulnerable to mysticism, which in turn opens them to fascism. Mysticism's purpose is to divert attention from daily misery with the belief in the afterlife, thus rendering materialism irrelevant and otherwise ludicrous struggles reasonable. Quote, both patriarchal family attitudes and mystical attitudes are the basic mass psychological elements of fascist and imperialist nationalism. The mother fixation created by Christian morality translates directly into the homeland feeling. These tendencies work best, Reich says, on sexually repressed, unpolitical people, code for the masses, who are not passively apolitical but actively so, as a defense against social responsibility. They are easily swayed by mysticism and deviant sex, which seem to momentarily resolve their inner conflicts. Religious people, unable to express their sexuality in healthy ways, become oversexed and perverted. Quote, happiness in this world is not only unattainable for him, but it does not even seem desirable to him. Hence, true Christians have no room for materialism. Instead, they form a dedication to impossible, otherworldly goals that work against their personal interests. Religion, politics, and mystical nationalism become the arousing agent rather than ordinary sexual possibilities. Masochism, Reich says, comes from the desire to enjoy pleasure without feeling guilt. If one is punished and then forced to feel pleasure, it is guilt-free. Quote, "Here lies the root of the ideology of passive suffering which is part of all patriarchal religions. The conscious longing is for a delivery from sin. The unconscious longing is for a delivery from sexual tension." Quote, "The religious individual negates his sexuality by mystifying the excitation. Religious feeling is subjectively genuine and has a physiological basis. The negation of the sexual nature of these excitations results, characterologically, in insincerity. The structure of the patriarchal individual is molded by sexual suppression." All of this begins when children are made to feel guilty and sinful for masturbating and referred to God for forgiveness. Reich also analyzes the Virgin Mary cult. Quote, "While the Jesus cult mobilizes the passive homosexual forces against genitality, the Virgin Mary cult utilizes forces from the heterosexual sphere itself. Do no harm to a girl and remember that your mother, too, was once a girl. Conceiving of all women as your mother, combined with the incest taboo, redirects the sexual energy of the man. Straight," Reich tellingly fails to note, he has something more particular to say about gay men, into mystical energy. Reich says that mysticism must be fought materially, ideologically, and culturally, but primarily on a sexual basis, since sexuality carries such emotional weight. That's why the Church chose that ground to fight on. Opposing this Christian programming is the political project Reich sees for therapists to show people the contradiction in their thoughts. The, quote, "task is that of making conscious the conflict and the suffering in the suppressed mass individual. The youth should be targeted with this approach. It is they who matter." And, in a prelude to the sexual revolution, youth is no longer on a mass basis accessible to a sex-negating ideology. German fascism also worked to win the youth base. Quote, "To do this, it had at its disposal no other means than the creation and the nurturing of submissiveness to authority, the basic prerequisite of which is an ascetic, sex-negative upbringing. The natural sexual strivings for the other sex, strivings which from infancy on urge for gratification, were replaced partly by homosexual and sadistic strivings, partly by asceticism. There was, for instance, the spirit of comradeship in the work-service camps, and the cultivation of the so-called spirit of discipline and self-sacrifice. These measures served the purpose of mobilizing sadistic brutality to be used in the imperialistic war. Sadism derives from unsatisfied orgiastic longing." This analysis stands in brutal contrast to the experience described by the concentration camp guard above, who felt that he had a healthy sex life until it was deformed by the redirection of his sexual energy into violence. Reich argues the reverse. In this theorizing of sexual deviance, Reich's contradictory and personally complicated relationship to sexuality is laid bare. He claims the patriarchy's governance of sexuality as something filthy and perverse has in fact made it filthy and perverse. Nor is his opposition to deviant sexualities limited to sadomasochistic impulses. He also opposes homosexuality. He uses this analysis to reinforce a view of sexual deviance as an unnatural development of civilization. It is to our advantage as homosexuals today that the gay tendencies of the Bund I previously described were not known to him to be further theorized in these directions. The Bund themselves might be pleased by the Platonic comparison, but horrified at their implication in modernity, surely the fault of the essentially feminine Jew, not the virile Aryan. These arguments flow directly from his belief in some essentially healthy, natural way to perform sexuality, some way, that is no longer a performance, but authentic reality to which society can and must return. That belief is not only something I find fundamentally untrue, but serves to justify his hatred of those he finds unnatural. Reich asserts, quote, "The adolescent develops a passive homosexual attitude. From the point of view of the dynamics of instinct, passive homosexuality is the most effective force against natural masculine sexuality, for it replaces activity and aggression by passive and masochistic attitudes, by the attitudes, in other words, which determine the structural basis of patriarchal authoritarian mysticism, the mass psychology of the followers of a religion, moral and often definitely physical masochism and physical submission. Religion derives its power from the suppression of genital sexuality, which, secondarily, produces passive and masochistic homosexuality. He later claims, meaning it as an insult, that in the fully developed patriarchy of Greek democracy, quote, the men's rule of the Platonic age is definitely homosexual. In this negative depiction of the passive homosexual as the perfect citizen, emasculated, unable to assert his rights or connect fully to others, Reich's contradictions, assumptions, and essentialism are at their worst. Sadly, he is not alone in these endeavors. Adorno, who always had too much to say, famously asserted that, quote, homosexuality and totalitarianism belong together. Women are not excluded from Reich's homophobic essentialist analysis. Quote, courtesans are women who rebel against the yoke of compulsive marriage and insist on their right to sexual self-determination. This demand, however, is in conflict with their early education, which made them incapable of full sexual experience. Therefore, the courtesan engages in all kinds of adventures in order to escape her homosexuality, or she continues to be torn between the two strivings. The male counterpart is the homosexuality of the men who escape from compulsive marriage to the courtesan or homosexual boys, and thus try to restore their capacity for sexual experience. No doubt Reich would feel confirmed in this analysis by the increasingly complex queer relationships of today, which, for those of us involved in them, feel not pathological but liberating. The sexual revolution Reich called for was, however, a temporary opening rather than an entirely revolutionary and healing rupture. James Baldwin writes, reflecting on the impact Reich's work on sexual liberation and the organ had on the time, quote, in retrospect, the discovery of the orgasm, or rather of the organ box, seems the least mad of the formulas that came to hand. It seemed to me that people turned from the idea of the world being made better through politics to the idea of the world being made better through psychic and sexual health, like sinners coming down the aisle at a revival meeting. And I doubted that their conversion was any more to be trusted than that. The converts, indeed, moved in a certain euphoric aura of well-being, which would not last. There are no formulas for the improvement of the private or any other life, certainly not the formula of more and better orgasms. Who decides? The people I had been raised among had orgasms all the time, and still chopped each other with razors on Saturday nights. We have also witnessed moments of revolutionary queer struggle since Reich wrote, defying his depiction of the homosexual as the perfectly governed, passive subject. And we could, though it would be a newly essentialist claim, profane his argument, reading it backwards to argue for the passive homosexual as the revolutionary subject in the war against natural masculine sexuality, tops down, bottoms up. Obviously, sexual repression has something to do with fascism, and you could argue that the people most likely to be fascist today are the most sexually repressed, but one cannot argue the inverse. As a generalization, Reich's analysis quickly becomes repulsive. I think Reich is right in saying that unhealthy psychological structures are fundamental to fascist thinking, but it is a terrible reduction to say it is all because of repressed sexuality. Fascism should not be reduced to a pathology any more than it should be reduced to a coincidence of historical factors. If one must attempt the project, I suggest the key element of fascist psychology was instead one of self-hating insecurity, either within themselves, against their subculture, or against their society in general. The Italian fascist intellectual Giovanni Papini said, for example, quote, nothing great can be made with shit. Italy of 1860 had been shit dragged kicking and screaming towards unification by a daring minority, and shit remained throughout 50 years of unification, urged on by the occasional outbursts of zeal from small minorities, either in favor of an imperial mission in Africa or of a liberating transformation in its domestic politics. We are a country of botched attempts. Everything is tried and nothing comes off. Wilhelm Reich rails against his detractors similarly in his epic polemic, Listen, Little Man. For the crime of refusing to believe that orgasmic energy could cure cancer, he accuses his opponents of a petty small-mindedness that is as outwardly destructive as it is inwardly. He does not shy away from comparing them to fascists. Yet, in his own life, Reich seems to have expressed the same small-minded, repressed tendencies. For all his talk of the socially redemptive power of sexual liberation, he pressured 3 of his partners to have unwanted abortions. The origin of his neuroses and fixation on painful sexuality is not obscure. Reich had an Oedipal relationship with his mother, and a brutal and sadistic father who made frequent unwanted advances to other women. Reich began having sexual experiences at the age of 4 and first had sexual intercourse when he was 11. When he was 13, he discovered his mother having sex with one of the tutors. When he told his father, he reacted so abusively that Reich's mother eventually committed suicide, for which Reich blamed himself. When Reich was 17, his father died, possibly intentionally out of guilt for his wife's death. Reich also felt responsible for that death. This is a terribly unfortunate history. Most people are motivated to pursue particular studies for personal reasons and should not be faulted for that. Analysts are deluding themselves that they claim to speak with any sort of objectivity. However, Reich's extrapolation of his own sexual and emotional trauma onto society tragically served to obscure the real gold in his analysis, the naming of character armor. We are all little men, Reich averred. Each of us has a little Hitler inside our hearts. We are damaged by the world and unable to fulfill our desires, and so we become neurotic, abusive, fascist. We can see a nesting series of these insecurities everywhere in what we have discussed. German insecurity contributed to Italian insecurity, both of which gave rise to fascism. Reich's analysis of the sexually dysfunctional basis of fascism betrays his own sexual insecurities, which gave rise to bad behavior in his personal life, the loss of his professional reputation, and a long series of failed experiments with insane machines and discredited therapeutic techniques. Also, all parties under discussion had a messiah complex. All thought they could save humanity from whatever they perceived as the great ill. Quote, in his last decades, Reich became persuaded that he was called to bear the burdens for a sexually starved and sadistic human race, and that he could point the way towards a new humanity if only his healing message could be heard. The same could be said for fascist idealists. While I don't see sexuality as a primary resource for fascism, I think that an interesting analysis of the fascist relationship to sexuality could be made. Foucault, a man much more at home in his perversions than Reich, had this to say. Footnote. By Reich's lights, Foucault was a prime candidate for fascism as a homosexual and sexual masochist. Foucault's Life and Politics alone gives Reich's argument the lie. Quote, while it is true that the analytics of sexuality and the symbolics of blood were grounded at first in 2 very distinct regimes of power, in actual fact the passage from one to the other did not come about, any more than did these powers themselves, without overlappings, interactions, and echoes. In different ways, the preoccupation with blood and the law has for nearly 2 centuries haunted the administration of sexuality. 2 of these interferences are noteworthy, the one for its historical importance, the other for the problems it poses. Beginning in the second half of the 19th century, the thematics of blood was sometimes called on to lend its entire historical weight towards revitalizing the type of political power that was exercised through the devices of sexuality. Racism took shape at this point, racism in its modern, biologizing, statist form. It was then that a whole politics of settlement, family, marriage, education, social hierarchization, and property, accompanied by a long series of permanent interventions at the level of the body, conduct, health, and everyday life, received their color and their justification from the mythical concern with protecting the purity of the blood and ensuring the triumph of the race. Nazism was doubtless the most cunning and the most naive, and the former because of the latter, combination of the fantasies of blood and the paroxysms of a disciplinary force. A eugenic ordering of society, with all that implied in the way of extension and intensification of micropowers, in the guise of an unrestricted state control, was accompanied by the honorific exaltation of a superior blood. The latter implied both the systematic genocide of others and the risk of exposing oneself to a total sacrifice. It is an irony of history that the Hitlerite politics of sex remained an insignificant practice, while the blood myth was transformed into the greatest bloodbath in recent memory. Reich fails to suggest anything half so compelling. His failure, in the end, is to seduce. The apocalypse has always been with us. Arendt argues that the impulse towards joining fascist movements was inspired by the contradictions and misery of capitalism and the modern nation-state, that these will almost inevitably give birth to fascism if there is no coherent alternative proposal. Quote, "If we compare this generation with the 19th century ideologists, with whose theories they sometimes seem to have so much in common, their chief distinction is their greater authenticity and passion. They had been more deeply touched by misery, they were more concerned with the perplexities, and more deadly hurt by hypocrisy than all the apostles of goodwill and brotherhood had been, and they could no longer escape into exotic lands, could no longer afford to be dragon slayers among strange and exciting people. There was no escape from the daily routine of misery, meekness, frustration, and resentment embellished by a fake culture of educated talk. No conformity to the customs of fairy tale lands could possibly save them from the rising nausea that this combination continually inspired. This inability to escape into the wide world, this feeling of being caught again and again in the trappings of society, added a constant strain and the yearning for violence to the older passion for anonymity and losing oneself. Arendt is often described as a self-hating Jew, a victim blamer, for her analysis of the role some Jewish community and religious leaders played in their cooperation with the Nazis. I find her, rather, to be making an argument about the role authority figures often play for any oppressed group in their negotiation with the world. By Arendt's analysis, quote, "If the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people." Furthermore, she sees the moral collapse of respectable Jewish society as rooted in these leaders' tacit agreement to the creation of privileged categories, that, by allowing a few Jews to be taken away in the name of saving the many, they implicitly accepted the idea that some Jews deserved to die more than others. This served to undermine the possibility of solidarity among those who are privileged today but doomed to die tomorrow, and promoted the idea of survival at any ethical cost. I think the acceptance and enforcement of essential categories, not to mention the dictates of any sort of leaders, will always undermine the survival efforts of oppressed people and serve the intentions of the oppressor. I believe we should resist any efforts made to form us into a mass, that is, an undifferentiated group of people whose only important attribute is that we are not the other, not the enemy, and recognize and celebrate our differences without letting them solidify into a new means of control. And if we find ourselves becoming a homogeneous group of any sort, we should force ourselves to become uncomfortable, to refuse the familiar. Many of us organizing against racism in the US in recent years have watched in horror as well-intentioned white allies drift more and more into the abyss of white identity. There is something destructive about recognizing the definitions of race enough to actually segregate yourself, no matter your intentions. Valorization of the gay elite and of a certain kind of relationship to the land deserve a special call-out for their current popularity in modern U.S. radical left circles. While I do not think either is necessarily fascist, their manifestations in pre-Nazi Germany show us that they are not necessarily practices of freedom either. Arendt also points out that essentialism engenders a false sense of security. If we know certain basic truths about how people of a category will always behave, we trust in the predictability of stories someone else wrote about how the world will operate. The Shoah changed that. Quote, "The tragic fallacy of all these prophecies, originating in a world that was still safe, was to suppose that there was such a thing as one human nature established for all time, to identify this human nature with history, and thus to declare that the idea of total domination was not only inhuman, but also unrealistic. Meanwhile, we have learned that the power of man is so great that he really can be what he wishes to be. We must also resist the urge to measure our deserved power or authority by our losses. While Jewish history is full of pogroms, expulsions, and role enforcement, there had always been, according to Arendt, the belief that, quote, the people of Israel shall live. Individual Jews, whole Jewish families might die in pogroms, whole communities might be wiped out, but the people would survive. The Shoah shook that belief to its core, creating a far compounded trauma of a different magnitude than the long-standing trauma experienced by Jews across centuries. That is tremendous. However, Harry Malysh, the great Dutch writer, whose mother was a Jew, but whose family largely escaped the gas chamber because of his father's collaboration with the Nazis, mused, quote, would the death of the Jews have been less of an evil if they were a people without a culture, such as the Gypsies, who were also exterminated? He concluded that it would not have been, but it's a hell of a question to pose if one considers the possible perspectives of Roma. Today, marginalized communities in the United States are often treated as if they have no particular culture worth saving. People talk of getting back to the land as if urban relationships to the land are meaningless. Exemplary immigrants, people of Asian and Indian descent, are exoticized and ignored in turn. We must refuse these divisions. And, importantly for our current situation, Arendt traces the origin of the police state to their management of stateless peoples. Quote, the nation-state, incapable of providing a law for those who had lost the protection of a national government, transferred the whole matter to the police. This was the first time the police in Western Europe had received authority to act on its own, to rule directly over people. In one sphere of public life, it was no longer an instrument to carry out and enforce the law, but had become a ruling authority independent of government and ministries. Its strength and its emancipation from law and government grew in direct proportion to the influx of refugees. The greater the ratio of stateless and potentially stateless to the population at large, the greater the danger of a gradual transformation into the police state. That the Nazis eventually met with so disgracefully little resistance from the police in the countries they occupied, and that they were able to organize terror as much as they did with the assistance of these local police forces, was due at least in part to the powerful position which the police had achieved over the years in their unrestricted and arbitrary domination of stateless people and refugees. The call for resistance on all of these fronts is not only ethically but practically vital. There were in fact many who refused to cooperate with the Nazis. Whether or not they survived, they give the lie to the idea that resistance would have been impossible. The most resistance to the rise of the Nazis within Germany came from the right, but most of these believed that a German civil war would be a great disaster, and so held back. It is also worth recalling that the government will almost always side with the fascists in the end. In 1920s Germany, as in Italy, the anarchists and the communists faced police repression, while fascist efforts were either ignored or directly supported by the police and military. As an SA slogan held, possession of the streets is the key to power in the state. And even if you cannot win or hold the streets, breaking consensus is a meaningful gesture. Discussing widespread, socially supported resistance to the Nazi program in Denmark, Arendt states, quote, it is the only case we know of in which the Nazis met with open native resistance, and the result seems to have been that those exposed to it changed their minds. They had met resistance based on principle, and their toughness had melted like butter in the sun. They had even been able to show a few timid beginnings of genuine courage. That idea of toughness, except, perhaps, for a few half-demented brutes, was nothing but a myth of self-deception, concealing a ruthless desire for conformity at any price. Footnote. We know of many more examples, though Arendt may have not, but Danish resistance was remarkably widespread and supported at least in part by the government. Even if the odds are dramatically stacked against the success of resistance, It challenges the notion of universal agreement with fascist principles in a way that can have a significant impact. It was the lack of such resistance and Nazi belief in group consensus that made the final solution possible. Quote, as Eichmann told it, the most potent factor in the soothing of his own conscience was the simple fact he could see no one at all, who actually was against the final solution. Those who did show their opposition seemed to have made a powerful impression on those around them. Even for the intended victims, resistance was the most tactically viable solution. Those interned primarily as belligerents, or who were never captured at all because they fought back, were far more likely to survive. Under totalitarian regimes, terror increases in inverse proportion to the amount of resistance it actually faces. Finally, we must preserve our ability to remember and mourn our dead, and fight for a world in which both their choices and ours are real ones. Attacking these elements of human experience was an innovation of the fascists. Quote, his death merely set a seal on the fact that he had never really existed. Totalitarian terror achieved its most terrible triumph when it succeeded in making the decisions of conscience absolutely questionable and equivocal. When a man is faced with the alternative of betraying and thus murdering his friends, or of sending his wife and children, for whom he is in every sense responsible, to their deaths, when even suicide would mean the immediate murder of his own family, how is he to decide? Who could solve the moral dilemma of the Greek mother who was allowed by the Nazis to choose which of her 3 children should be killed? When our enemies give us such choices, our only possible response is communal defiance.
Thanks for listening to this reading of The Unquiet Dead. And for the following chapters, go to resonanceaudiodistro.org. Also, check out this trailer for one of our sister projects through the Channel Zero network.
We are at war!
The Soulcast is a twice-a-month anarchist podcast hosted by North American rap artist Soul. It's a podcast about revolutionary politics from an anarchist perspective. Every month I interview academics, journalists, revolutionaries, quote-unquote activists, artists, musicians, and really anything that I find interesting. I never got to go to college, so this, I guess, is my cheat sheet. So anybody who wants to learn,